The bell above the door of Coleman's gunsmithing chimed at 9:47 on a Tuesday morning, and the young man behind the counter looked up from his coffee just long enough to dismiss the woman walking in. She wore the faded green apron of the diner across the street, her name tag still pinned crooked above her heart. And in her arms, she carried a rifle wrapped in an old wool blanket, like something a person might bring to a funeral. Her hands were steady. Her eyes were not asking for anything. And the moment she set that rusted, pitted, scarred old weapon on the glass counter, the young gunsmith laughed out loud. The kind of laugh a man uses when he wants everyone in the room to know he is smarter than the person standing across from him. He called the rifle junk. He called it a paperweight. He told her, with a smirk curling under his trimmed beard, that she should melt it down for scrap and buy something a woman could actually handle. She did not flinch. She did not answer. She simply waited, because she had learned a long time ago that some men dig their own graves with their own mouths. So tell me honestly, before this story even begins, have you ever underestimated someone based on what they were wearing and lived long enough to regret it? Her name was Sergeant First Class Elena Marisol Vasquez, though the name tag on her apron only said Elena. And the regulars at Murphy's Diner only knew her as the quiet woman who poured coffee with two hands and never spilled a drop. She had been waiting tables in that small Montana town for almost 14 months. Ever since the Army had finally released her from a medical hold that lasted 3 years longer than any of her doctors had predicted. The shrapnel in her left hip still woke her at 4 in the morning most days, and the hearing in her right ear came and went like a radio signal in a thunderstorm. But she had stopped complaining about either one a long time ago. Complaint, she had learned in 18 years of service, was a luxury for people who had never truly suffered. She rented a small room above the hardware store, drove a 1998 Ford Ranger that she maintained herself, and spent her evenings reading library books about beekeeping because she had decided that whatever came next in her life would involve quiet work and living things. The rifle that she carried into Coleman's gunsmithing that Tuesday morning was not hers. It had belonged to her grandfather, Master Sergeant Ramon Vasquez, who had carried it through 3 tours in Vietnam and brought it home in a duffel bag along with a bronze star and a silence that lasted until the day he died. Elena had inherited the rifle when she was 19 years old, the same year she enlisted, and she had promised the old man on his deathbed that she would keep it functional, keep it clean, and keep it ready. For 17 years, she had kept that promise herself, stripping it down on kitchen tables in barracks from Fort Bragg to Bagram, oiling the bolt with the same patient discipline he had taught her when she was small enough to sit on his knee. But the firing pin had finally cracked, and the spring had finally weakened, and she needed parts that nobody in Montana stocked anymore. So she had walked across the street that morning with her grandfather's rifle wrapped in his old wool blanket, and she had asked a 26-year-old man named Travis Coleman if he could help her. And Travis Coleman had laughed. Travis had grown up in that shop, watching his father Walt Coleman work miracles on weapons that other smiths had given up on. And somewhere along the way, he had confused proximity to skill with the actual possession of it. He had a community college certificate in firearms technology, 2 years of paid apprenticeship under his father, and a YouTube channel with 11,000 subscribers where he reviewed tactical rifles and made fun of people he called fuds. He believed, with the absolute certainty of a young man who has never been truly tested, that he understood everything worth understanding about the trade. So when Elena unwrapped the blanket and revealed an M14 that had clearly seen decades of hard use, with a stock darkened by sweat and a barrel pitted from humidity, it had survived in places Travis could not have found on a map. He did exactly what his ego demanded. He laughed, and then he gestured to the modern rifles in the glass case behind him, and he asked her if her boyfriend had told her to bring this antique in for an appraisal. Elena looked at him for a long moment, the kind of look that older soldiers learn to give younger ones, and she said quietly that she needed a new firing pin, a recoil spring, and the gas cylinder lock checked for wear. Travis snorted. He told her the parts alone would cost more than the rifle was worth, that the receiver was probably out of spec, that she would be better off selling it to a collector who could mount it on a wall. He spoke loudly enough for the 2 other customers in the shop to hear him, because humiliating her was part of the performance. Elena did not raise her voice. She did not correct him. She had spent 18 years learning that the loudest voice in any room was almost always the most frightened one, and that real authority never had to announce itself. Instead, she asked if Walt Coleman was in the shop today. Travis bristled at the mention of his father's name, because every young man who has not yet earned his own reputation hates being measured against the man who built the building he stands in. He told her his father was in the back office, that his father was busy, that whatever she needed could be handled by him. Elena nodded once, the small, precise nod of a non-commissioned officer who has just decided to wait out a fool rather than argue with one, and she said she would wait. She walked to the wooden bench by the window, sat down with her grandfather's rifle across her knees, folded her hands on top of the blanket, and went perfectly still. Travis went back to his coffee, certain he had won something. He had no idea that the woman by the window had once spent 19 hours pinned down behind a collapsed wall in San Jin, and that waiting was a thing she had practiced at a level he could not imagine. She had enlisted at 19 because her grandfather had asked her not to, and because she had needed to understand for herself what he had carried home in his silence. Basic training at Fort Jackson had broken her down to almost nothing and built her back up into something her own mother did not recognize at graduation, and she remembered her first drill sergeant, a small, wiry woman named Staff Sergeant Boudreau, telling her on the last day that the Army did not make you tough, it only revealed what you had always been. Elena had carried that sentence with her for 18 years. She had served first as a wheeled vehicle mechanic, because her grandfather had insisted that she learn a trade the Army could not take from her, and she had been good at it. Good enough that by her third year, she was running her own bay and training privates twice her size in how to pull a transmission without breaking their hands. But somewhere along the way, between deployments to Iraq and a hard winter at Fort Drum, she had been pulled aside by a captain who had watched her shoot on a qualification range and asked her if she had ever considered going further. She had reclassed to small arms repair, and from there she had gone to the Army Marksmanship Unit Selection Course, and from there, eventually, after years of work that nobody outside the unit ever heard about, she had become one of fewer than a dozen women in the entire United States Army to hold the additional skill identifier of Master Gunsmith. She had built rifles for snipers whose names appeared in no newspaper. She had rebuilt weapons recovered from ambushes, weapons buried in mud, weapons whose owners had not come home. She had taught classes at Fort Benning to men who arrived skeptical and left her workshop calling her ma'am without irony. And through all of it, on her own time, in her own quarters, with her own hands, she had maintained her grandfather's M14. Because the promise she had made to a dying man at 19 years old had become the spine of the woman she was at 37. The hip injury had ended her career on a road outside Kandahar when an IED flipped the truck she was riding in and killed the driver. A 22-year-old specialist from Ohio whose mother Elena had written a letter to every Christmas since. She had walked out of Walter Reed 11 months later with a cane she no longer used, a retirement she had not asked for, and a quiet decision that she would spend whatever time remained to her in a small town where nobody knew what she had done, because she had learned that the loudest part of service was the part you kept to yourself. That was the woman sitting by the window of Coleman's gunsmithing, waiting patiently while a young man drank his coffee and believed he had taught her a lesson. Walt Coleman came out of the back office at 10:15, wiping bluing solvent off his hands with a rag that had been red once and was now mostly brown. And he was halfway to the coffee pot when he saw the woman sitting by the window with a rifle wrapped in a wool blanket across her knees. He stopped. He looked at the rifle. He looked at her face. And then Walt Coleman, who had served 24 years in the United States Army and retired as a command sergeant major, did something his son had never seen him do for a customer in his entire life. He came to attention. It was not a sharp parade ground snap, because his back would not allow that anymore, but it was unmistakable. The small straightening of the shoulders and the lift of the chin that any soldier in the world would have recognized. He said, very quietly, "Sergeant Vasquez." Elena stood up, the rifle cradled in her arms, and she said, "Sergeant Major." Travis, behind the counter, felt the temperature of the room change in a way he did not understand. His father walked across the shop floor, took Elena's free hand in both of his own, and held it for a long moment without speaking. Then he said, "I did not know you were in Montana." Elena said, "I did not advertise it." Walt nodded slowly, because he understood that sentence in a way his son could not. He had read her name in a citation 11 years earlier, when his old friend Colonel Hendricks had sent him a copy of an after-action report from a forward operating base in Helmand Province. The kind of report that did not make the news because the people in it did not want it to. He had read about a small arms repair sergeant who had spent 19 hours holding a defensive position with 3 wounded men and a rebuilt machine gun she had repaired under fire using parts from 2 other weapons. He had read about the Bronze Star with V device that she had received quietly at a ceremony attended by 14 people. He had read her name, and he had remembered it, the way old soldiers remember the names of soldiers they have never met but somehow already know. Walt turned to his son. He said, "Travis, come here." Travis came around the counter slowly, the smirk gone from his face now, replaced by the first faint awareness that he had stepped into something he did not understand. Walt said, "Travis, this is Sergeant First Class Elena Vasquez, United States Army, retired. She is a master gunsmith. She has forgotten more about the M14 platform than you and I will ever learn between us." Travis opened his mouth. He closed it. Walt said, "I heard you laughing when I was in the back. I want you to apologize to this woman, and then I want you to stand behind that counter and listen to her, because she is about to give you the most important lesson you have ever received in this shop, and you are going to take it like a man." Travis apologized. The words came out rough and uncertain, the way apologies always do from people who have not had to give many of them, but he said them. And Elena accepted them with a small nod that contained neither warmth nor cruelty. Only the practiced neutrality of someone who had been apologized to by better men than him for worse things than this. Then she unwrapped the blanket. She laid the M14 on the felt mat that Walt pulled across the counter, and she began to talk, not to Travis exactly, but to the rifle itself. The way old craftsmen do when they are explaining something to someone who has not yet earned the right to be talked to directly. She showed him the serial number, and she told him about the Springfield Armory production run it had come from. And she told him about the small mark her grandfather had filed into the underside of the receiver, a single notch that meant nothing to anyone except the family of the man who had put it there. She field stripped the rifle in front of him in under 30 seconds, her hands moving with a fluency that Travis recognized immediately as something beyond his own ability. The way a piano student recognizes a concert pianist by the first 3 measures. She laid the parts out in perfect order. She pointed to the cracked firing pin, and she explained why it had cracked, and she explained the metallurgical reason that surplus pins from a certain decade were prone to that exact failure. She pointed to the recoil spring, and she told him the exact compression tolerance it had fallen below, and she told him how she knew. And she told him the cycle count at which she had predicted this failure 6 years earlier and written it in a logbook in her own handwriting. She pulled that logbook out of the inner pocket of her apron, a small leather notebook softened by years of use, and she opened it to a page Travis could see. And there in neat block letters was a maintenance entry dated 2019, predicting the failure of the exact part she was now replacing. Walt watched his son's face the entire time. He had been waiting for this moment for years, the moment when Travis would meet someone who could not be dismissed, could not be talked over, could not be reduced to a punchline on a YouTube channel. He had tried to teach the boy himself, but a father's lessons land differently than a stranger's. And Walt had known for a long time that his son would need to be humbled by someone he could not explain away. Elena did not humiliate him. She did not have to. She simply did the work, and she explained it as she went, and she answered his questions when he finally began to ask them. Hesitant at first, and then with a growing hunger that Walt had not seen in his son in years. She told him that the rifle had belonged to her grandfather. She told him about the 3 tours in Vietnam. She told him about the promise she had made at 19, and she told him that the reason she maintained the weapon herself was not because she did not trust other gunsmiths, but because the act of maintaining it was the way she still spoke to a man who had been dead for 18 years. Travis listened, and somewhere in the middle of that hour, something in his face changed, and the young man who had walked into work that morning began, very quietly, to disappear. She came back 3 days later to pick up the parts she had ordered through the shop, and Travis was waiting for her at the counter with the rifle already laid out, cleaned, and ready for her to do the final assembly herself, because he had understood without being told that this was a job she would finish with her own hands. He had also done something else. He had pulled down the YouTube video he had filmed 2 weeks earlier mocking what he had called grandpa rifles, and he had filmed a new one in its place. A short video in which he sat in front of his father's workbench and talked, without naming her, about a woman who had walked into the shop and taught him more in 1 hour than he had learned in 2 years of formal training. He talked about humility. He talked about the difference between knowing about a weapon and knowing a weapon. He talked about the men and women who had carried rifles like the one she brought in, and he talked about how easy it had become, in a generation raised on tactical catalogs and internet forums, to forget that every old rifle in every small-town shop had a story that deserved to be asked about before it was laughed at. The video did not go viral. It got about 4,000 views, fewer than his usual numbers, and the comments were mixed, because the internet rarely rewards humility. But Walt watched it 3 times the night Travis posted it, and the next morning he came into the shop early and put a hand on his son's shoulder and said only, "That was a good thing you did." Elena finished the assembly on her grandfather's M14 at the bench by the window, the same bench where she had waited 3 days earlier. And when she dry-fired it for the first time and felt the clean break of the new firing pin, she closed her eyes for a long moment. Travis saw her do it, and he understood, finally, that what he had been laughing at on Tuesday morning had not been a rusted old rifle at all. It had been a relationship between a woman and a dead man, a promise kept across 2 wars and 18 years and 1 hard road outside Kandahar. And it had been the spine of someone whose spine was made of harder material than anything sold in his glass cases. She paid for the parts. She thanked Walt by name, and she thanked Travis by name, and the use of his name was a gift she did not have to give him, and he knew it. She wrapped the rifle in the wool blanket. She walked out of the shop, across the street, and back to the diner, where she tied her apron back on and poured coffee for the lunch rush. And not one customer who sat at her counter that afternoon had any idea that the woman refilling their cups had, 3 hours earlier, taught a young man the most important lesson of his working life simply by refusing to be small in the face of his contempt. Elena Vasquez kept waiting tables at Murphy's Diner for 2 more years before she finally bought the small plot of land outside town that she had been saving for. And she started the beekeeping operation she had been reading about for so long. And she lived a quiet life that the people around her never fully understood. Travis Coleman finished his apprenticeship under his father, and then he did something nobody expected of him, which was to enlist in the Army Reserve at the age of 27 and apply for the same small arms repair school that Elena had attended almost 2 decades earlier. He graduated in the top 3 of his class. He came home a different man, and he ran his father's shop with a humility that became, over the years, the reason customers drove from 3 counties away to bring him their old rifles. The ones with stories, the ones other Smiths had laughed at. Walt Coleman lived long enough to see all of it. And the M14 that started everything still sits, to this day, in a glass case above Elena's mantel, oiled twice a year by her own hands. The small notch on the underside of the receiver still visible to anyone who knows where to look. Her story is not the story of a hero, because she would refuse that word, and it is not the story of a victim, because she would refuse that one even faster. It is the story of a woman who learned early that real strength does not announce itself, that real skill does not need to be defended, and that the loudest voice in any room is almost never the one worth listening to. She represents every quiet veteran in every small town, every woman whose service was never seen, every soldier who came home and chose dignity over recognition. And if her story teaches anything, it is this: never measure a person by the apron they are wearing, because some of the hardest people in this country are pouring your coffee, and they have already forgiven you for not knowing it.